The peace deal with Afghanistan has now been signed. So what happens next? If only we had an example of what happens when a superpower retreats from Afghanistan. It would make my life a lot simpler. Let me think of a few examples. I couldn't find any. We've been in this exact same position a few times over the course of history. In order to find out what happens next, let's take a look at what happened when the Soviet Union retreated from Afghanistan in the late 80s. The warlords that had temporarily united to overthrow Najibullah and his government and drive the Soviets out all of a sudden realized that they did not have much else in common. They were ethnically different, they spoke different languages, and had differing religious views. To make things simple for us, let's divide Afghanistan and its ethnic makeup into two categories. First is the Pashtuns living primarily in the eastern part of Afghanistan and spill over into Pakistan. The second category, the Persian-speaking Afghans that primarily live in the western part of Afghanistan, comprise of several other ethnicities and spill over into Central Asia. The Taliban represent the Pashtun community of Afghanistan. Throughout history, they have bitterly fought to maintain Pashtun hegemony all over Afghanistan. And the Persian-speaking communities have largely consolidated to resist this as much as possible. The Soviet invasion allowed the traditional enemies, Pashtuns and the Persian-speaking Afghans, to temporarily unite to drive them out. Once the Soviet Union was driven out, what they left behind was a big power vacuum. Then began the epic power struggle to rule over Afghanistan through a brutal civil war. After the Soviet withdrawal, the US lost its interest in the region, and as a consequence, so did CNN, New York Times, and the ABC. The world completely ignored what was happening in Afghanistan until 9/11. Look, it's not surprising at all. Our attention span about this kind of stuff is so horrible that nowadays journalists that dedicate their entire lives to covering a region have to depend on Trump's tweets to get the media to focus on an issue. Remember this guy?
Scandals happen all the time. The question is, how do democracies respond? Pardon me.
He is an academic who has spent his entire life researching on Korea, but since the world moved on, he does this for a living.
Yo, bro, have you seen this? See this? Big dummy! Big dummy! Big dummy! Crash landing! Big crash landing! Oh,
And a little bit helpful.
I'm happy he's making money, but this is incredibly sad. Back to the Civil War. Meanwhile, Russia, because of its total collapse, was no longer calling the shots in Central Asian countries like Turkmenistan, Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. These countries are loaded with oil and gas reserves, and after the fall of Soviet Union, open for business. In particular, Turkmenistan, with over 600 million barrels of proven oil reserves and 265 trillion cubic feet of natural gas. If you don't know how much that is, just know it's a lot. There's a problem though. Turkmenistan is stuck. Its geography gives it all of these natural treasures, but at the same time, no way to sell it. It can only supply its gas to the world via Russia, which it does a little bit, but Russia has its own gas to sell and forces Turkmenistan to keep the prices below market rate. Turkmenistan has no other option, so this sale comes with high economic dependence on Russia. The most obvious and economical route to reach European and South Asian markets would be through Iran, but that's essentially off the table because American sanctions mean no one would buy that gas. And even if you could find a market, no bank would be willing to fund the project. There was a proposal to build a pipeline through the Caspian Sea into Turkey, but that project got shelved very early when the costings were done. Then this guy had an idea. Carlos Bulgaroni, CEO and owner of Bridas, an oil and gas holding company based in Argentina. A gas pipeline could be laid out from Turkmenistan through Afghanistan into Pakistan to access the huge South Asian market that needed natural gas as much as this lady needs toilet paper. Great idea. One problem. Afghanistan is at war with itself. Breda started courting the different warlords and factions fighting for power. This included the now infamous Taliban, but the negotiations for the pipeline included anyone and everyone that had the capability to be a spoiler. Breedis also pitched the proposal to Benazir Bhutto, the Prime Minister of Pakistan, and Niyazov, President of Turkmenistan, both of whom to say were on board is an understatement. Breedis recognized that for this project they need a lot more funding than they currently have in their coffers. So they pitched this project to an American oil company, Unoco, for a partnership. Unoco did their initial feasibility studies and realized that if they were to lay out this pipeline, the profits are incredible. And this was the beginning of what journalists covering the region call the new great game. The term great game comes from the 19th century rivalry between the British Empire and the Tsarist Russian Empire. Both empires were so paranoid of each other using Afghanistan to launch an invasion on their own territories that they fought bitterly to control Afghanistan. And at that time, this rivalry was called the Great Game. The new Great Game was not much different, except instead of empires, it was oil and gas companies backed by their states that were calling the shots in Afghanistan. Unoco quickly decided to cut Breedis from the project altogether to gain a bigger share of the pie, and they had the Clinton administration to help them. The State Department, with its contacts with the ISI, Pakistani intelligence agency, backed the Taliban to take over all of Afghanistan to lay the foundations of the pipeline. This was only part of the story though. The word had gotten out. Russia and Iran, who were not happy with being left out, backed their own proxies in the Persian-speaking parts of Afghanistan to defeat the Taliban and get their own oil companies like Gazprom to build the pipelines instead, leading to a faction whose entire policy was to avoid peace under any circumstances. What ensued for close to a decade was a brutal war to control the country. Each player fighting on the ground had the backing of some regional power or some oil company, until Al-Qaeda, hosted by the Taliban, started attacking the US in the late 90s. And the final blow was 9/11. The US recalibrated its Afghanistan policy and launched a full-scale invasion and completely switched sides from the Taliban to the Persian-speaking factions in Afghanistan. US for almost the next 2 decades tries to establish peace through a war with the Taliban, unsuccessfully. So fast forward to now. The US is leaving Afghanistan, but the inherent vested interest of all the countries haven't gone anywhere. Every stakeholder still wants a piece of the pie, and the Taliban, still a force to be reckoned with, wait for the patrons of the Persian Afghan forces to completely leave and repeat history once again by fighting and taking control of Afghanistan. Unless a super consensus is created amongst all parties without depriving any stakeholder, particularly Iran or Russia, any long-term peace or stability is unlikely to take place. And as you can imagine, this kind of stuff is hard to do. So what's likely to follow now is the new great game version 2.0.